Most people think a cyber attack looks like this: some guy in a hoodie, typing fast, breaking through a firewall in the middle of the night. That is the image Hollywood sold us, and honestly, it is the image most cybersecurity channels keep repeating. But that is not how a lot of major breaches happen anymore. In a growing number of cases, nobody had to break in at all. Somebody on the inside simply opened the door. Because they were paid to. Welcome to Cyber Safety Brief, where we break down simple, practical cybersecurity advice for everyday Americans, without the jargon and without the panic. Before we go further, a quick note. This video is based on authentic, legal, and publicly available cybersecurity information. Everything you are about to hear is meant for awareness and protection only. We are not going to talk about how these schemes are carried out step by step, and we are not going to glamorize any of it. The goal here is simple. Understand the risk so you can recognize it, whether you are an employee, a manager, or a small business owner. So here is what this video will not be. It will not be a list of use a strong password tips. It will not be another generic watch out for phishing emails video. Those things matter, but they are not what is quietly reshaping the cybercrime landscape in the United States right now. What we are actually going to talk about today is a shift that a lot of regular people have never even heard of: the rise of the paid insider. Real employees, contractors, and even IT staff being approached, tempted, and in some cases recruited by criminal groups, not to hack anything, but simply to hand over access. In my opinion, this is one of the most underestimated threats facing American businesses today, precisely because it does not look like a cyber attack in the traditional sense. There is no dramatic breach alert. There is no suspicious-looking email. There is just a person doing their job who quietly decided to say yes to an offer. And here's the part that I think should genuinely concern more people than it does. This isn't some rare, isolated tactic used by one or two obscure criminal groups. Security researchers, corporate investigators, and federal agencies have all, separately, started flagging this as a rising pattern across multiple industries at once. That kind of overlap doesn't happen by accident. It happens when something actually works, and word spreads inside criminal circles the same way any effective tactic spreads in any other industry. Let's get into it. Point 1. The attack that doesn't look like an attack. Here is a question worth sitting with for a second. What does a cyber attack actually look like from the inside of a company? Most people imagine some kind of technical alarm going off. But if an employee already has legitimate login credentials, legitimate access to files, and a legitimate reason to be in the system every single day, then a criminal group does not need to hack anything. They just need that person to look the other way or actively help for a price. This is what security researchers call an insider threat, but it has evolved. It used to mean a disgruntled employee who got fired and decided to cause damage on their way out. That still happens. But what is growing now is something more organized and more deliberate. Threat actors actively recruiting people who are already employed, sometimes even applying for jobs themselves just to get inside a company legally. Think about how strange that sentence actually is. A criminal organization filling out a job application, going through an interview, getting hired, and then working a normal job while quietly setting up access for a future attack. It sounds like something out of a spy movie, but it has become a documented pattern that security teams across multiple industries are now trained to watch for. What I personally think is unsettling about this is how normal it looks from the outside. The person still shows up to meetings. They still answer emails. They still seem like a completely average employee. There is no red flag waving over their head. That is exactly why this method works, and exactly why traditional cybersecurity training does not really prepare people for it. A real-life pattern that has shown up across multiple industries, including finance, healthcare, and tech, involves remote IT workers being offered money to install remote access tools on company laptops or to quietly share credentials with an outside party. In some cases, the person did not even fully understand the scale of what they were enabling. They just saw it as a quick way to make extra income on the side. Safe defensive steps here start with something every company, no matter the size, can do: separate access by necessity. Not every employee needs access to every system. The fewer people who can open a given door, the smaller the risk that one of those people gets tempted to leave it open. This is sometimes called the principle of least privilege, and it is one of the most effective, boring, unglamorous defenses that exists. I think it's worth pausing here to point out something that often gets missed. Companies love to talk about trust as if it's a fixed thing you either have or don't have with an employee. But trust isn't really binary. A person can be completely trustworthy in every part of their life and still make one bad decision under enough financial pressure. That's not a comfortable thing to say out loud, but I think pretending otherwise is exactly why so many businesses get caught off guard. The goal of good security design isn't to assume your team is dishonest. It's to build a system where a single person's bad decision, whatever the reason behind it, can't cause catastrophic damage on its own. There's also a technical side to this worth mentioning briefly, without getting into anything unsafe. When access is properly segmented, an insider can usually only expose the specific slice of information they were given, not the entire company's systems. That difference alone can turn a potential company-ending breach into a contained, manageable incident. It's the digital version of not giving every employee a master key to every room in the building just because they work there. Point 2. Why the offer? Even works here is something that rarely gets talked about honestly. Insider recruitment does not usually target greedy people. It targets people who are financially stressed, underappreciated, or quietly frustrated at work. In my opinion, that is the part that makes this uncomfortable to discuss, because it is not really a story about villains. It is a story about pressure. Picture an IT support employee making a modest salary, dealing with rising rent, maybe supporting a family, and someone reaches out claiming to represent a consulting firm that wants to pay a large one-time fee for helping with a security assessment. The message sounds semi-professional. It does not scream criminal. It is worded just vague enough to feel deniable. The way I look at it, this is basically social engineering aimed at a person's financial situation instead of their inbox. Traditional phishing tries to trick your click. This tries to test your price. A real-world example of this pattern involves criminal groups impersonating legitimate recruiters on professional networking platforms, offering freelance IT consulting gigs that are actually fronts for gaining remote access to company systems. The offers often look completely ordinary at first, which is exactly the point. What most people underestimate is how gradual this process usually is. It rarely starts with, "Help us steal data." It starts small, a simple request, a small favor, a modest payment. Then the ask grows once trust or dependency has been established. By the time the requests become clearly illegal, the person may already feel too involved to say no. Defensive steps for individuals here are simple but important. If you are ever approached, even informally, with an unusually generous offer tied to your workplace access, that is a moment to pause. Report it to your employer's security or HR team rather than handling it privately. For businesses, this means creating a genuinely safe, non-punitive way for employees to report suspicious approaches without fear of being treated like a suspect. If people are afraid to speak up, they simply won't. I also think it's worth mentioning why these approaches often succeed even with cautious, otherwise sensible people. Financial stress does something specific to decision-making. It shortens your time horizon. When you're worried about this month's bills, an offer that solves an immediate problem can feel a lot more reasonable than it would if you were financially secure and thinking 5 years ahead. That's not an excuse for crossing a legal line, but understanding this dynamic is exactly why companies that pay fair wages, communicate honestly, and treat employees with basic respect tend to be less vulnerable to this kind of recruitment. It's not a guarantee, but it does change the math. There's also a broader trend worth noting here. These approaches increasingly happen entirely online, through direct messages or encrypted chat apps, rather than in person. That means the stranger with a briefcase full of cash image most people picture is almost entirely outdated. In reality, it often looks like an ordinary message in your inbox, worded just professionally enough to seem legitimate at first glance. Point 3. The contractor blind spot. Full-time employees are not the only people with access to sensitive systems. Contractors, freelancers, and third-party vendors often have just as much access, sometimes more, and often with far less oversight. In my opinion, this is one of the biggest gaps in American business security today. A company might spend a fortune training its own staff on cybersecurity awareness, while a third-party contractor with full system access has had almost no vetting at all beyond a basic background check. Here's a pattern that has shown up repeatedly. Attackers targeting IT staffing agencies rather than the companies themselves, knowing that contractors placed by these agencies often get fast-tracked access to client systems with minimal scrutiny. It is a supply chain problem, but for people instead of software. The way I see it, businesses have gotten fairly good at asking, "Is our software patched?" but far worse at asking, "Who exactly has the keys to our building, and did we really check who they are?" Both questions matter equally. Safe defensive steps. Any business using outside contractors for IT, tech support, or system administration should require the same background diligence for those contractors as it would for a full-time hire with equivalent access. Access should also be time-limited and reviewed regularly, not granted once and forgotten. If a contract ends, access should end immediately, not whenever someone remembers to revoke it. I would also like to know your opinion here. Do you think small businesses are more exposed to this kind of risk simply because they can't afford the same vetting processes as larger companies? Let me know in the comments. Point 4. The myth that this only happens to big companies. There is a comfortable myth that insider recruitment only targets massive corporations, banks, or government agencies. In my opinion, that myth is actually part of what makes small and mid-sized businesses more vulnerable, not less. Think about it logically. A small business often has fewer internal controls, less formal IT security staff, and a much smaller team where everyone tends to trust everyone by default. If a criminal group can get even one person on the inside of a smaller company, the lack of internal checks can make it easier, not harder, to quietly move data or access without anyone noticing for a long time. A well-documented example type involves small accounting or bookkeeping firms, which often hold financial access for dozens of client businesses at once. A single compromised or bribed employee at one of these firms can create a ripple effect across every client they service. This is exactly why criminal groups sometimes prefer smaller service providers as a target, rather than a single large company with a dedicated security team watching every login. What I personally think small business owners get wrong is assuming that cybersecurity investment only makes sense once we get bigger. In reality, the smaller the internal team, the more damage a single compromised or bribed person can do relative to the size of the company. Defensive steps for smaller businesses do not have to be expensive. Basic access logging, so you can see who accessed what and when, is often free or low cost with tools businesses already use. Requiring 2 people to approve major financial transfers, rather than one person having unilateral authority, closes a huge portion of this risk almost entirely, regardless of company size. Point 5. What happens after the access is given? Once access has been handed over, whether through bribery, blackmail, or manipulation, what actually happens next tends to follow a fairly quiet pattern. It is rarely a dramatic, sudden theft. It is usually slow, deliberate, and designed to avoid detection for as long as possible. In my opinion, this slow-burn approach is what makes insider-enabled breaches so much harder to catch than a traditional hack. A sudden, aggressive attack tends to trigger alarms. A slow, patient one, using legitimate credentials during normal business hours, often looks like nothing at all. This is why security teams increasingly talk about behavioral monitoring rather than just technical monitoring. It's not only about watching for strange code or unfamiliar IP addresses anymore. It's about noticing unusual patterns in how a legitimate, authorized user is behaving. Are they accessing files they've never needed before? Are they logging in at odd hours? Are they downloading unusually large amounts of data compared to their normal role? The way I look at it, this shifts the entire mindset of cybersecurity. It's no longer just keep the bad guys out. It's notice when someone who's supposed to be inside starts acting differently. Safe legal defensive steps here include enabling activity logs and access alerts on sensitive systems, something most business software already offers but many companies never turn on. For individuals, this also means understanding that your own account activity is often visible to your employer's security systems, which is exactly why insider schemes eventually tend to get caught, sometimes months or even years later. Point 6. The human side. Nobody talks about. Here's something I think deserves more honesty in cybersecurity content. Not every person who becomes an insider threat set out to be a criminal. Some are manipulated, some are pressured, some genuinely did not understand the scale of what they were agreeing to until it was too late. I do not think this is about being paranoid. I think it is about being prepared and about recognizing that this issue sits at the intersection of financial stress, workplace culture, and criminal opportunity. Blaming the individual entirely misses half the picture. A workplace where people feel disposable, underpaid, or invisible is unfortunately a more fertile environment for these approaches to succeed. What most people underestimate is that strong cybersecurity culture isn't only about firewalls and passwords. It's also about creating a workplace where people feel valued enough that a stranger's offer of quick money doesn't feel worth the risk. That's not a technical fix. That's a leadership and culture fix, and it's one companies rarely invest in when they think about cybersecurity. For employees watching this, if you ever feel like your job or your financial situation makes you a target for this kind of approach, that is not a personal failure. It's a genuinely difficult position to be in. The right move is always to talk to someone you trust, whether that's HR, a manager, or even law enforcement, rather than handling it alone. I would love to hear your opinion on this too. Do you think this problem is more about criminal recruitment tactics or more about how companies treat their employees? Let me know what you think in the comments because I think both sides of this argument have real merit. Point 7. Why detection often comes too late. Here's a question that doesn't get asked enough. If insider-enabled breaches are so quiet and so gradual, how do companies ever catch them at all? The honest answer is often not quickly. Investigations into these kinds of incidents frequently reveal that the unusual activity had been happening for weeks or months before anyone noticed, and in some cases, it was only caught because of an unrelated audit or a routine system check, not because a security tool flagged it in real time. In my opinion, this delay is one of the most important things for both employees and business owners to understand. It changes the entire mindset around insider risk. This isn't a problem you can solve with a single piece of software you install once and forget about. It requires ongoing attention, regular review of who has access to what, and a willingness to actually look at activity logs instead of just collecting them and hoping nothing is wrong. What I personally think a lot of smaller companies get wrong is treating cybersecurity monitoring as something you set up once during onboarding and never revisit. Access needs get reviewed at bigger companies through formal audits, but a lot of small and mid-sized businesses simply don't have that process at all. Nobody is checking 6 months later whether a former contractor's login still works, or whether an employee who changed roles still has access to systems they no longer need for their current job. Safe defensive steps here are refreshingly simple. Set a recurring calendar reminder, even a basic one, to review who has access to your most sensitive systems every few months. Remove access the moment someone leaves a role, not when you get around to it. And if your business uses any kind of cloud storage or shared drive, take 10 minutes every quarter to actually look at who has edit or download permissions. Most businesses are surprised by what they find when they finally check. Point 8. What this means for the average employee. Up to this point, we've talked a lot about businesses and how they should respond, but I think it's just as important to talk directly to the average employee watching this, because you are part of this picture too, whether you realize it or not. The way I see it, most people will never be directly approached with an offer like the ones we've described today, but almost everyone will, at some point, notice a coworker behaving strangely, receive a suspicious message that seems slightly off, or be asked to do something at work that doesn't quite sit right. In my opinion, trusting that instinct matters more than people give it credit for. If a coworker starts asking unusual questions about systems outside their normal job responsibilities, or seems to be accessing files that have nothing to do with their role, that's not necessarily proof of anything. People are curious, and there are plenty of innocent explanations. But it's also not something to automatically dismiss. The right move isn't to accuse anyone or play detective. It's simply to mention what you noticed to the appropriate person, whether that's a manager or a security contact, and let people whose job it is to investigate actually do that job. What most people underestimate is how much of a role ordinary employees play in catching these situations early, simply by paying attention and speaking up when something feels off. You don't need a cybersecurity background to notice when something doesn't add up. You just need to take that feeling seriously instead of talking yourself out of it. So here's where that leaves us. Cybercrime in the United States is not only about malware, phishing emails, or hooded figures typing in dark rooms. Increasingly, it's about human relationships, financial pressure, and quiet offers made to ordinary people who have legitimate access to systems companies depend on. In my opinion, this is exactly why awareness matters as much as technology. You can install every security tool in the world, but if a legitimate, trusted person is convinced to open the door willingly, a lot of that technology becomes far less effective. None of this means you should walk into work tomorrow suspicious of every coworker or assume every contractor is secretly working for a criminal group. That would be exhausting, and honestly, it would be the wrong lesson to take from this. The real takeaway is much simpler. Understand that trust and security aren't opposites. A workplace can be built on genuine trust and still have smart, sensible safeguards in place, the same way a house can have a lock on the door without anyone assuming their neighbors are burglars. If this video helped you see cybersecurity from a different angle, do me a favor and like the video, and subscribe to Cyber Safety Brief for more simple, practical cybersecurity advice explained without the jargon and without the fear tactics. Stay alert, stay informed, and stay safe online. Before you go, comment below. Which part of this surprised you the most? The idea that criminals apply for real jobs, or the idea that this often targets people who are simply struggling financially?